I never expected to inherit my grandfather's lake house. It had been in the family for generations, a secluded retreat buried deep in the woods, with nothing but miles of still water and towering pines to keep it company. As a child I had visited a few times, but after my grandfather passed, the house sat empty, forgotten, collecting dust and memories no one wanted to claim. That changed when I lost my job. I needed time to clear my head, and the idea of isolation was appealing. A week of solitude, away from the noise of the city, sounded perfect. No distractions, just me and the lake. The first night was peaceful. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the rhythmic lapping of the water against the shore lulled me to sleep. But on the second night, I awoke to a sound outside my window, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the gravel path that wrapped around the house. My stomach twisted as I reached for the flashlight on my nightstand. I flicked it on and aimed it outside. Nothing. Just trees swaying under the silver moonlight. I convinced myself it was a deer or maybe a stray dog from a nearby cabin. But the feeling of unease lingered. On the third night I saw him. I had stayed up late, reading on the couch, when something outside the window caught my eye. At the edge of the woods, just where the trees thickened into darkness, a figure stood. At first I thought it was a man, a tall man, but something was off. His limbs were too long, unnaturally so, and his head tilted in a way that made my stomach churn. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching. A cold sweat broke out on my skin. My breathing shallowed. My first instinct was to grab my phone, but the moment I moved, he disappeared. 1 second he was there, the next, gone. I rushed to the window, shining my flashlight through the trees. Nothing. Only the distant rustling of wind through the leaves. At dawn, I forced myself to go outside, to prove to myself that it had all been in my head. But as I neared the tree line, my breath hitched. Footprints. Deep, clear footprints led from the woods to my window, but there were none leading away. That night, I locked every door and window. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't let me. Every creak of the old house made my heart pound. Around 2 a.m., the scratching began. A slow, deliberate scrape against the wooden walls, moving from one side of the house to the other. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was measured, intentional. I stayed frozen in bed, listening as the sound circled the house. Then silence. For what felt like hours, I didn't move. My fingers dug into the blanket. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. And then, 3 sharp knocks. Not at the door, but at my bedroom window. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I knew, deep in my bones, that if I looked I would see him. The thing from the woods. Waiting. Watching. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed. But at some point, exhaustion took me, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found something worse than footprints. Near the front door, scratched into the wood, were 3 words, "Let me in." I packed my bags in under 5 minutes. I didn't care about leaving anything behind. I threw my things into my car and sped down the dirt road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I didn't stop. Not until I was miles away, not until the trees thinned and the weight in my chest lessened. I never went back to the lake house. I signed it over to a real estate agent, and never looked at the listing again. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of gravel crunching outside my apartment window, and I wonder, did I really leave it behind? A week passed after I left, and I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Stress, paranoia, tricks of the night. But then my phone rang, an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I answered. "You left in a hurry," a low, distorted voice whispered. I froze. My blood turned to ice. "Who is this?" Silence. And then, the sound of gravel crunching. I hung up and blocked the number, but the unease never left me. That night, I double-checked every lock, shut every curtain, and tried to sleep. But at 3 a.m., I woke up to a noise outside my window. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, my pulse hammering in my ears. The sound was rhythmic, precise, like fingers drumming against the glass. I didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at me to stay hidden under the covers. But something else, curiosity, fear, or some primal urge, forced me to turn my head. A shadow, tall, too tall. I leapt from my bed, grabbed my phone, and dialed 911 with shaking hands. The dispatcher answered, but before I could speak, the tapping stopped. I pulled back the curtain, and there was nothing there. Just my dimly lit street, empty and still. The police arrived, took my statement, and found no signs of forced entry. They told me it was likely a prank. Maybe a neighbor, maybe a coincidence. But I knew better. The thing from the woods had found me. For the next few weeks, the calls continued. Always from an unknown number. Always silent, except for that faint, distant crunching sound. Then, one night, I woke up to my apartment door slightly open, the locks broken. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was disturbed. But on my kitchen counter, scrawled into the wood, were the same 3 words. Let me in. I moved that same night. Packed my things, left town, changed my number. I never told anyone where I went. And yet, some nights, no matter where I am, I hear it. The sound of footsteps in the gravel. The tapping on the glass. And I know, he's still watching. The summer Lucas invited me to his family's lake house was supposed to be one of the best times of my life. It was our final summer before college, one last stretch of freedom before the real world pulled us in different directions. The house itself was old, creaky, and filled with shadows that seemed to shift when you weren't looking. But we were 18, we didn't care. The lake was massive, its still waters a perfect reflection of the dense pines that surrounded it. During the day, it felt serene, almost hypnotic. But at night, when the sun dipped behind the trees and the sky turned ink black, it took on a different quality. The air felt heavier. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore, it was expectant. We spent our days swimming, fishing, and lying on the dock, letting the sun bake our skin. Our nights were filled with bonfires, cheap beer, and ghost stories. None of us actually believed in the supernatural, of course. That changed on the night we took the canoe out. It was a perfect evening. The sky painted in streaks of red and gold, the lake so still it looked like glass. Lucas and I paddled toward the center, the rhythmic dip of our oars the only sound. We floated there for a while, talking about life, about how everything was about to change. Then, out of nowhere, we heard it. A splash. Not the gentle ripple of a fish breaking the surface. This was different, heavier, as if something, or someone, had fallen in. Then came the sound that made my stomach drop, a gasp. Choking. The unmistakable, panicked struggle of someone drowning. I turned to Lucas, my pulse hammering. Did you hear that? He nodded, his face pale. He gripped his oar tighter, his knuckles white. Then we heard it again. A strangled cry, barely above a whisper. Help me! The voice was warped, as if the water itself was speaking, thick and garbled. It came from directly beneath the canoe. I leaned over, my breath hitching. The water was dark, bottomless. My reflection wavered on the surface. And then, it wasn't just my reflection staring back. A face emerged from the depths. A girl, her skin pallid and waterlogged, her eyes wide and glassy, her mouth twisted in silent terror as her hands shot up, reaching. I screamed. The canoe rocked violently as I flailed, nearly tipping us over. Lucas shouted my name, grabbing my arm, but I couldn't look away. She was right there, just below the surface. And then, just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. Paddle! I shouted. Now! Lucas didn't hesitate. We tore through the water, the canoe lurching with every frantic stroke. I didn't dare look back. I felt her down there, lurking beneath us, watching, waiting. By the time we reached the dock, we were breathless. The house lights glowed warmly in the distance, but I'd never felt so cold. Lucas' parents were inside, playing cards. We burst through the door, dripping wet, rambling over each other as we tried to explain what had happened. His mother's face went blank. His father's grip on his beer tightened. You didn't see anything, his dad said, voice firm. It was just the water playing tricks on you. Lucas looked at me, his expression screaming the same thought I had. He was lying. Later that night, after his parents had gone to bed, we snuck out. We needed answers. If they wouldn't tell us, someone else would. There was an old man who lived further down the lake, alone in a cabin that sagged with age. We had seen him a few times, but never spoken to him. That night we did. He was already outside when we arrived, sitting in a rocking chair, staring out at the lake as if he had been waiting for us. You boys saw her, didn't you? He said before we could speak. Lucas and I froze. The old man sighed. She was just a kid, 14. Summer of '82. Went swimming by herself. Her parents thought she was up in her room. By the time they realized she was missing, it was too late. A chill crawled up my spine. Did they ever find her? He shook his head. That's the thing. They dragged the whole damn lake. Spent weeks looking. Never found a body. Just gone. I swallowed hard. So what is she? A ghost? Something worse. His eyes were dark, unreadable. Some folks say she never left. That she's still down there, reaching up, trying to pull someone else under. A gust of wind rippled across the lake, sending a shiver through me. I suddenly felt exposed, like something unseen was watching from the shore. We left in silence. That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face beneath the water, her hands reaching, drowning, desperate. The next morning, I told Lucas I was leaving early. I made up some excuse, family emergency, sudden plans, but the truth was, I couldn't stay. Not after what I'd seen. Not with the lake still calling. Lucas didn't argue. I think he understood. We never talked about that night again. We went to college, moved on, grew up. But sometimes, late at night, I dream about that lake. I hear the splash, the gasping, the whisper thick with water. Help me. And sometimes, in the silence of my apartment, I wake up to the sound of dripping water. And I know, she's still waiting. The decision to take a solo retreat to a remote lakeside cabin was supposed to be a peaceful escape from the suffocating city life. Work had drained me, my relationships felt shallow, and I was desperate for solitude. The idea of disconnecting, just me, nature, and absolute silence, seemed perfect. The drive was long, the roads winding through dense forests that swallowed the last traces of civilization. By the time I arrived, dusk had begun to settle, the sky painted in streaks of fading orange. The cabin itself was older than I expected, weathered wood, a sloping roof, and windows that seemed darker than they should have been. But the view? Breathtaking. The lake stretched out endlessly, its surface smooth as glass, reflecting the towering pines that surrounded it. The first night, I settled in with a book and a cup of tea, reveling in the deep quiet. No sirens, no honking cars, just the rustling trees and the occasional call of an owl. But as I lay in bed, sleep came uneasily. Then I heard it. Soft whispers. I bolted upright, my pulse hammering. The sound wasn't inside the cabin but just beyond the walls, outside my window. Murmurs, unintelligible, yet insistent. I strained to make out the words, but they were just out of reach, dissolving into the night air. Then, a gust of wind swept through the room, and I realized something that made my stomach drop. The window was open. I knew for a fact I had locked it before bed. I leapt up and slammed it shut, latching it securely. Maybe the wind had forced it open. Maybe the lock was old. I told myself a dozen different reasons before exhaustion eventually won, pulling me into an uneasy sleep. The second night, the whispers returned. But this time, they were clearer. Come outside. My breath hitched. The voice was soft, almost pleading, but something about it made my skin crawl. I sat up, heart hammering against my ribs. The air in the cabin had turned frigid. Slowly, I crept toward the window and peeked outside. My throat tightened. A woman stood at the edge of the lake. She wore a long white dress that billowed slightly in the night breeze. Her back was turned to me, her long black hair cascading down her spine, unmoving, as if even the wind dared not touch it. The water lapped at her feet, soaking the hem of her dress, but she didn't move. Then she whispered my name. I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair. My mind raced. Had I imagined it? No. The sound had been clear, too precise. My flashlight sat on the nightstand. Hands shaking, I grabbed it and aimed it toward the window. The beam flickered wildly before dying completely. I fumbled with the switch, my breath coming in short gasps. When I looked up again, she was gone. But wet footprints trailed from the dock to my front door. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the cabin sent shivers through me. By dawn, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I didn't care if I lost my deposit or wasted the trip. Something was wrong with this place. As I stepped onto the porch, duffel bag in hand, I froze. Carved into the wooden planks in deep, jagged letters was a single word. Stay. The letters were uneven, almost frantic, as if someone, or something, had gouged them into the wood with bare hands. My stomach turned as I traced the edges with my fingers, splinters biting into my skin. That was it. I ran to my car, threw my bag in the passenger seat, and tore down the winding road without looking back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, heart still pounding. I told myself it was over, that whatever I had experienced was just exhaustion, an overactive imagination, stress manifesting into hallucinations. Then I made the mistake of asking about the cabin. I had stopped at a gas station in the nearest town, trying to shake the unease. The attendant was a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a knowing look, like he had seen people like me before, people who had spent a night too many at that cabin. "You stayed at the lake?" he asked as he rang up my water bottle and energy drink. I nodded. "Only for a couple nights." He glanced at me, hesitating. "Which cabin?" Third one down, right by the dock." His face changed. A flicker of something, pity, fear? He placed his hands on the counter and leaned in slightly. "No one's rented that cabin in years. Not since." He stopped himself, shaking his head. "You're lucky you left." My mouth went dry. "Not since what?" He exhaled through his nose, as if debating whether to tell me. Then, in a low voice, he said, "Last guy who stayed there, never left." A chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" "A man booked it years ago. Solo retreat, like you. He told folks in town he needed time away from everything. Spent a week there. When the owner went to check on him, he was gone. No note, no sign of a struggle. His car was still there, keys in the ignition, cabin door locked from the inside. But the strangest thing?" I swallowed hard. "What?" That word. I knew what he was going to say before he even said it. Stay. It had been carved into the walls, the bed frame, the floorboards. As if, in his final moments, he had tried to leave himself a message. I didn't respond. I couldn't. "Best forget about it," the attendant said, handing me my change. "And don't go back. No matter what." I nodded, gripping the counter to steady myself. Then, without another word, I left. That was 6 months ago. I haven't spoken about it since. Haven't even looked up the history of that cabin. But some nights, when the world is quiet and I'm on the edge of sleep, I swear I hear it again. A whisper, so close it sends ice through my veins. "Come outside." And I know, no matter how far I run, no matter how many doors I lock, the cabin still calls my name.